Picture the 1995-96 NBA season. There is a guard in Denver who is doing things with a basketball that the league will not fully appreciate for another 20 years. He pulls up from ranges that make coaches wince. He shoots free throws at a rate so pure it borders on mechanical perfection. A 95.6% clip the season before. The third highest single-season mark in the history of the sport. He scores 19.2 points per game. He drops 51 on the Utah Jazz in a single night. He dishes 20 assists against the Phoenix Suns in another. He is 5'10", maybe 160 pounds soaking wet, and he plays like he is invincible. Now, fast forward. 2 years later, his scoring average has collapsed to 7.3 points per game. 2 years after that, he is out of the NBA entirely. And 1 year after that, his house in rural Mississippi has been burned to the ground. Investigators determined it was arson. The FBI opened a case. No one was ever charged. This is not a story about substances. It is not a story about crime or reckless living. It is not a story about an injury that stole a career. This is the story of a man who was too talented to ignore and too principled to keep quiet. And the NBA made him pay for it. He was suspended. He was fined $31,707 for every game he missed. He was traded, he was exiled, and then he was forgotten. His name was Mahmoud Abdul-Rauf. Before that, it was Chris Jackson. And long before Stephen Curry made the long-range pull-up three-pointer the most celebrated weapon in basketball, this man was already doing it, night after night, in a league that wasn't ready. Today, we trace the full arc. From a childhood in poverty on the Mississippi Gulf Coast, to an undiagnosed neurological condition that nearly buried him in special education, to a record-shattering college career, to an NBA peak that should have been a launching pad for stardom. And then, the moment everything changed. A decision about the national anthem that turned one of the most electric scorers of the 1990s into the most controversial player in the league. But to understand how this man ended up losing everything, you need to go back to where it all started. A town on the Mississippi Gulf Coast, where a boy with an undiagnosed neurological condition was placed in special education and written off before he ever touched a basketball. Christopher Wayne Jackson was born on March 9, 1969, in Gulfport, Mississippi. He came into the world with almost nothing on his side. He was raised in a single-parent home. There were stretches when proper nutrition simply was not available. Gulfport was not a place that invested heavily in kids who looked like they might fall through the cracks. And by every visible measure, Chris Jackson looked like one of those kids. What nobody around him understood, not his teachers, not the school administrators, not even his family for most of his childhood, was that Chris had Tourette syndrome. It would go undiagnosed until he was 17 years old. For the better part of his youth, the tics, the involuntary movements, the compulsive behaviors that came with the condition were interpreted as something else entirely. A discipline problem, a learning deficiency, a child who could not sit still and could not focus. The system's answer was special education. They placed him in classes designed for students the school had decided could not keep up. And in a community without resources, without specialists, without any real understanding of what Tourette syndrome even was, that label stuck. Chris Jackson, the kid from the single-parent home in Gulfport who couldn't stop moving, was written off. Think about that for a moment. Think about how many children in how many towns across this country have been put into a box they did not belong in, simply because the adults around them did not have the tools to understand what they were seeing. Chris Jackson was not slow. He was not incapable. He had a neurological condition that the people in charge of his education had never been trained to recognize. And yet, Somewhere inside this child who had been pushed aside, there was something extraordinary waiting to emerge. It just needed someone to see it. And then, on a playground in Mississippi, a coach who had never worked with boys in her life saw something in this kid that nobody else had seen. And that moment changed everything. The story of how Chris Jackson was discovered is one of those details that reminds you how random greatness can be. How thin the line is between a life that changes the world and a life that disappears into it. A middle school coach, a woman who had never coached boys basketball in her career, happened to be near a playground in Gulfport. And on that playground, she saw a kid playing pickup ball. He was small, he was wiry, but there was something about the way he moved, the way the ball came off his hands, the way his instincts operated 3 steps ahead of every other kid on that court. She did not walk past. She stopped. She watched. And then she did something that altered the entire trajectory of his life. She brought him into organized basketball. Before that moment, Chris Jackson had no structure around his talent. He had a body full of Tourette-driven energy and a mind that had been told over and over again that he did not belong in the same rooms as other kids. But once he entered organized basketball, the raw ability was impossible to deny. He was faster than everyone. His hands were quicker. And his shooting, even at that young age, had a purity to it that coaches simply do not see very often. What Tourette syndrome had given him, beyond the struggles, was an almost superhuman capacity for repetition. The same compulsive tendencies that made classroom life unbearable made him a relentless practicer. He would shoot the same shot hundreds of times, thousands of times, driven by an internal engine that would not let him stop. The routines, the rituals, the obsessive refinement, they forged one of the purest shooting strokes that basketball would ever produce. By the time Chris Jackson left high school, he had been named Mississippi Mr. Basketball not once, but twice, in 1987 and again in 1988. The kid from special education, the boy from the single-parent home who sometimes did not have enough to eat, was now headed to the McDonald's All-American Game, standing alongside the best high school players in the entire country. But what he did at LSU would shatter records that had stood for decades. 2-time Mississippi Mr. Basketball, McDonald's All-American. These were not honors that came easily from a town like Gulfport, and they were not honors that the basketball world took lightly. By the time Chris Jackson's high school career was finished, every major college program in the country knew his name. The kid who had been placed in special education was now the most coveted recruit in the state of Mississippi, and one of the most talked-about guards in the entire nation. He chose LSU. He chose the program run by Dale Brown, a coach known for his intensity, his willingness to take chances on unconventional players, and, as it would turn out, his habit of handing books to young men that might reshape the way they saw the world. Dale Brown would later give Chris Jackson a copy of the autobiography of Malcolm X. That single gesture, a coach handing a book to a freshman, would set off a chain of events that no one at LSU could have predicted. But that was still in the future. In the fall of 1988, Chris Jackson arrived on the LSU campus as a freshman with enormous expectations. The SEC had seen great guards before. It had seen high school phenoms arrive with fanfare and then fade under the pressure of college basketball. The question everyone was asking was simple. Could this undersized kid from the Gulf Coast actually deliver on the hype? Nobody was prepared for what Chris Jackson was about to do as a freshman at LSU. He would score more points than any first-year player in NCAA history, and one night against Ole Miss, he would put up a number that left the entire arena in disbelief. In 32 games during the 1988-89 season, Chris Jackson scored 965 points. That was 30.2 points per game. As a freshman, it was the NCAA record for points scored by a first-year player, and it announced his arrival in a way that no highlight reel could match. This was not a player who needed time to adjust to the college game. He dominated it from the first week. The shooting was the centerpiece. He could score from anywhere, mid-range, beyond the arc, off the dribble, off the catch, in transition, in the half court. Defenders who played him tight got blown past. Defenders who sagged off got burned from distance. There was no correct answer, because his release was so fast and his confidence was so absolute that hesitation on the defensive end meant points on the scoreboard. And then came March 4th, 1989. LSU against Ole Miss. Chris Jackson scored 55 points in that game, including 10 three-pointers. 55 points, 10 threes, as a freshman, in the SEC. The performance was staggering not just for the numbers, but for the efficiency, the control, the sense that he could do this whenever he wanted and had simply chosen this particular night to prove it. He was named SEC Player of the Year. He was named a first-team All-American, both as a freshman. These were distinctions typically reserved for upperclassmen, for players who had spent years refining their games at the college level. Chris Jackson earned them in his first season. His sophomore season was just as devastating, and by the time he was done at LSU, he had earned something that very few players ever receive. But it would take 30 years for the university to give it to him. His second season at LSU removed whatever doubt remained. Chris Jackson came back in 1989-90 and did it all over again. SEC Player of the Year for the second consecutive time, first-team All-American for the second consecutive time. 2 years on campus, 2 years of the highest individual honors the conference and the nation could offer. That kind of back-to-back dominance from a player who had not yet turned 21 was virtually without precedent. There was nothing left to prove in college basketball. He had broken the freshman scoring record. He had earned every major individual award available to him, twice. Defenses had game planned specifically for him for 2 full seasons, and he had burned them anyway. The NBA was not just calling, it was the only logical next step. He declared for the 1990 draft after his sophomore year and left LSU as one of the most electrifying players the program had ever produced. And yet, the university would not retire his number 35 jersey until 2020, a full 30 years after he walked off that campus. 30 years. Think about what that gap means. Think about the kind of career arc and public controversy that has to unfold for a school to wait 3 decades before honoring its most statistically dominant player. The delay was never formally explained, but for anyone who followed what happened to Chris Jackson after he left Baton Rouge, the silence from LSU spoke volumes. In June 1990, the Denver Nuggets would make Chris Jackson the 3rd overall pick in the NBA draft. He was about to enter a league that would love his talent, but would struggle deeply with the man he was about to become. Draft night, June 1990. The Denver Nuggets held the 3rd pick. They used it on Chris Jackson, the undersized, lightning-quick guard from LSU who had torn through the SEC like no freshman or sophomore before him. At 5'10", he was smaller than almost every guard he would face in the professional game. But the Nuggets believed the shooting, the speed, and the fearlessness would translate. Denver in the early 90s was not a destination franchise. It was not a team that attracted marquee free agents or commanded national television audiences. The Nuggets were building, searching for an identity, and Chris Jackson was supposed to be the foundation. A young, dynamic scorer who could fill seats and carry an offense. The expectations were enormous for a 21-year-old adjusting to a new level of basketball while quietly managing a neurological condition that most of his teammates and coaches barely understood. His rookie season confirmed the talent was real. He showed flashes of the scoring ability that had made him a college legend: the quick release, the deep range, the fearless attacks against bigger defenders. By the end of that first year, he was named to the NBA All-Rookie Second Team. Not the first team, but a clear signal that the league recognized what he could become. The adjustment was underway. The tools were all there. It was just a matter of time and opportunity. But during that very first year in Denver, something happened that had nothing to do with basketball. His coach at LSU, Dale Brown, had given him a book before he left. And now, in his rookie season, that book was leading him toward a transformation that the NBA had never seen before. Before Chris Jackson left LSU, Dale Brown handed him a copy of the autobiography of Malcolm X. It was the kind of gesture a mentor makes without knowing where it will lead. A book passed from coach to player, may be intended to broaden a young man's perspective, may be intended as nothing more than good reading. But for Chris Jackson, it opened a door that would reshape his entire identity. During his rookie year in Denver, he was introduced to the Quran. The ideas he had encountered in Malcolm X's autobiography now found a deeper framework, a spiritual architecture that resonated with everything he had experienced. The poverty, the marginalization, the feeling of being misunderstood and underestimated by systems that were supposed to help him. He converted to Islam during that first NBA season. The conversion was private at first. He studied, he prayed, he began to see the world through a different lens. But by 1993, the transformation became public and permanent. He legally changed his name from Christopher Wayne Jackson to Mahmoud Abdul-Rauf. This was not a nickname adopted for flair. It was not a marketing decision. It was a legal, spiritual, definitive act. A man declaring that the person he had been was not the person he was going to be. He was not the first professional basketball player to convert to Islam. Kareem Abdul-Jabbar had done so decades earlier and become one of the most celebrated athletes in American history. But the era was different now. The political climate was different. And what Mahmoud Abdul-Rauf would do with his faith in the years ahead would push the boundaries far beyond what Kareem or anyone else had tested. The name change raised eyebrows, but did not end careers. What Mahmoud Abdul-Rauf did next, however, would test the limits of what the NBA and America was willing to tolerate from an athlete. In 1993, the same year he announced his new name to the world, Mahmoud Abdul-Rauf won the NBA Most Improved Player award. It was a statement. The conversion had not distracted him, the name change had not rattled him, and the basketball was getting better, not worse. He was evolving into one of the most dangerous scoring guards in the league, a player whose offensive arsenal was expanding season by season. That same year, he did something that remains one of the most peculiar footnotes in NBA history. He participated in the 1993 Slam Dunk Contest. The catch? He had never dunked in an actual NBA game. Not once. The Denver Nuggets general manager had sent a tape of Abdul-Rauf throwing down dunks in practice. Practice dunks from a 5'10" guard known exclusively for his shooting, and somehow got him an invitation to the contest. It was absurd, it was entertaining, and it captured something essential about who he was as a competitor. He feared nothing, and he would try anything. But the real story of his ascent was not about dunks, it was about precision. His shooting was reaching levels that defied what anyone thought a player his size could sustain in the NBA. He was pulling up from distances that most guards in the early 90s considered reckless. He was creating his own shot against elite defenders, with a release so quick that contests arrived after the ball was already gone. And at the free throw line, he was becoming something close to automatic. The numbers were climbing. The respect around the league was growing. And then came the 1993-94 season, when Mahmoud Abdul-Rauf did something at the free throw line that put him in the company of the greatest shooters who had ever lived. There is a number in basketball that separates the very good from the historically elite, and in the 1993-94 season, Mahmoud Abdul-Rauf planted his flag on the far side of that line. He shot 95.6% from the free throw line. That was not just the best mark in the NBA that year. It was the third highest single-season free throw percentage in the entire history of the league. Out of every player who had ever stepped to the charity stripe in an NBA game, only 2 had ever been more accurate in a single season. Think about what that number means. Out of every 100 free throws he attempted, he missed fewer than 5. The margin for error at that level is essentially non-existent. A slight hitch in the elbow, a fraction of a degree off in the wrist, a single moment of lost concentration, and the percentage drops. Maintaining that kind of precision over the course of an entire NBA season requires something beyond natural talent. It requires obsession. And that is where the story circles back to something from his childhood that the adults in Gulfport had treated as a deficiency. His Tourette syndrome, the very condition that had landed him in special education, that had made teachers and administrators write him off as a problem child, may have been the engine behind his greatness at the free throw line. The compulsive repetition that is a hallmark of the condition drove him to practice the same shot over and over, hundreds of times in a single session, until every element of the motion was locked into his nervous system. The rituals before each attempt, the precise positioning of his hands, the identical rhythm every single time. These were not quirks. They were the product of a mind that demanded perfection through repetition, and a body that could not rest until it achieved it. He would lead the league in free throw percentage again in 1995-96, this time at 93%. 2 seasons atop the entire NBA in the most fundamental individual skill in the sport. The boy the system had discarded was now doing something that almost no human being in the history of basketball had ever done as well. By December 1995, Abdul-Rauf was playing the best basketball of his life. On one unforgettable night against the Utah Jazz, he would score 51 points. And just weeks later, against the Phoenix Suns, he would dish out 20 assists. He was reaching a level that suggested superstardom was within reach. But the explosion was only months away. December 8, 1995. The Denver Nuggets against the Utah Jazz. This was not a soft opponent. The Jazz of that era were built around John Stockton and Karl Malone, anchored by one of the tightest defensive systems in the Western Conference. Teams did not waltz into games against Utah and put up crooked numbers. The Jazz made you earn every basket, ground you down in the half court, and dared you to beat them with individual brilliance. Mahmoud Abdul-Rauf scored 51 points that night. 51 against that defense, from a player listed at 5'10". He did it with the same arsenal that had been terrorizing the league for years. The pull-up jumper from absurd distances, the lightning-quick first step into the lane, the free throws that might as well have been automatic. But on this night, everything was amplified. Every shot seemed to carry a little more arc, a little more certainty. The Jazz had no answer, because there was no answer. When a shooter of that caliber reaches that kind of rhythm, the only option is to wait for it to end. It did not end until he had put up a number that fewer than a handful of players in the entire league would reach that season. Weeks earlier, in November 1995, he had done something arguably even more surprising. Against the Phoenix Suns, he recorded 20 assists in a single game. 20. That is a number typically associated with elite point guards at the peak of their playmaking powers, players whose entire identity revolves around setting up teammates. Abdul-Rauf was known primarily as a scorer, and yet, in a single game, he demonstrated that he could dissect a defense, find open men, and run an offense at a level that most career facilitators never reach. His scoring average for the 1995-96 season sat at 19.2 points per game. He was 26 years old. The trajectory pointed in only one direction: upward. He had the shooting, the passing, the free throw perfection, and the fearlessness. Everything suggested that the best years were still ahead. And then, during this very same season, at the height of his powers, Mahmoud Abdul-Rauf made a decision that would cost him his career. He stopped standing for the national anthem. To understand the magnitude of what happened next, you have to understand the era. This was 1996. There was no Twitter. There was no Instagram. There was no infrastructure for athlete activism. No precedent in modern professional sports for what Mahmoud Abdul-Rauf was about to do. Colin Kaepernick's kneeling protest was still 20 years in the future. The expectation in American professional sports was absolute and unquestioned. When the anthem played, you stood. You placed your hand over your heart. You faced the flag. And you kept your opinions, whatever they were, to yourself. During the 1995-96 season, Mahmoud Abdul-Rauf stopped standing for the national anthem before games. He did not kneel. He did not raise a fist. He simply stayed seated, or stood in the tunnel, away from the court, while the anthem played. For a stretch of games, the act went largely unnoticed. The cameras were not focused on the bench during the anthem. The public did not yet know. And then it became public. And when it did, Abdul-Rauf did not retreat. He did not offer a vague, diplomatic explanation. He said it directly. The American flag, in his view, was a symbol of oppression. He cited what he described as a long history of tyranny by the United States. He said that standing for the anthem conflicted with his Islamic faith. These were not hedged statements issued through a publicist. These were the words of a man who had decided that his conscience mattered more than his comfort. The reaction was immediate and ferocious. In the mid-90s, with the country operating under a very different set of cultural assumptions about patriotism, sports, and protest, his words landed like a grenade. Fans were outraged. Media commentators were outraged. The league itself was caught in a position it had never faced. A player openly refusing to participate in a pre-game ritual that the NBA considered mandatory. On March 12, 1996, the NBA suspended Mahmoud Abdul-Rauf. The financial penalty was steep: $31,707 for every game he missed, docked directly from his salary. The league's message was unmistakable: you will stand or you will not play. 2 days later, a compromise was reached. Abdul-Rauf agreed to stand during the anthem, but on his terms. He would close his eyes and silently recite an Islamic prayer, a prayer for those suffering across all backgrounds and all nations. It was not capitulation. It was negotiation. He found a way to be present without betraying what he believed. But the damage was already done. The suspension had lasted only days. The fallout would last for years. The compromise did not quiet the storm. It intensified it. Mahmoud Abdul-Rauf had been suspended, had agreed to stand with eyes closed in prayer, and still, for a significant portion of the public and the sports establishment, it was not enough. He had said the words. He had called the flag a symbol of oppression. And in the America of 1996, Those words could not be taken back. The hostility extended well beyond arena crowds and angry callers on sports radio. In one of the most disturbing incidents connected to the controversy, 4 employees of Denver radio station KBPI were charged with misdemeanor offenses after they entered a Colorado mosque and played the national anthem on a bugle and trumpet. This was not satire. This was not a stunt that stayed in a broadcast studio. These individuals walked into a house of worship, a place where people gathered to pray, and used the anthem itself as a weapon of intimidation. They were charged. The incident was documented, and it sent a chilling message about what Abdul-Rauf's protest had unleashed. Inside the NBA, the landscape was shifting beneath his feet. He finished the 1995-96 season in Denver, but the relationship between the player and the franchise had been fundamentally altered. The Nuggets were a small market team that could not afford the kind of controversy Abdul-Rauf now carried with him everywhere he went. Sponsors were uncomfortable. The front office was under pressure. The simplest solution, the solution that professional sports has always preferred when a player becomes more trouble than he is worth on the court, was to make him someone else's problem. In June 1996, just months after the suspension and the firestorm, the Denver Nuggets traded Mahmoud Abdul-Rauf to the Sacramento Kings in exchange for Sarunas Marciulionis and a second-round draft pick. A second-round pick for a player who had scored 51 points in a game that very season. For a player who had led the league in free throw shooting twice. For a player averaging over 19 points per game. That was the price the market set on a man who had spoken his mind about the flag. The trade was not about basketball. Everyone in the league knew it. And what happened next in Sacramento would confirm what many already suspected, that Mahmoud Abdul-Rauf's days as a featured player in the NBA were over. What happened inside NBA arenas, the boos, the hostility from opposing crowds, the cold distance from league officials, was ugly enough. But the rage that Mahmoud Abdul-Rauf's protest generated did not stay inside arenas. It spilled out into the real world, into places that had nothing to do with basketball, and it crossed lines that should never have been crossed. In the weeks following the controversy, 4 employees of KBPI, a Denver radio station, were charged with misdemeanor offenses after they physically entered a mosque in Colorado and played the national anthem on a bugle and trumpet. They walked into a house of worship, a place where families gathered to pray, and used the anthem as a tool of harassment. This was not a prank call. This was not an angry segment broadcast from the safety of a studio. These individuals left the station, drove to a mosque, and staged an act of deliberate provocation against a Muslim community that had nothing to do with any basketball dispute. Criminal charges were filed. The incident was documented in court records and widely reported. Let that settle for a moment. A professional athlete expressed a belief rooted in his faith. He was suspended by his league, and in response, people who disagreed with him decided the appropriate reaction was to invade a place of worship and turn the very anthem at the center of the dispute into an instrument of intimidation. That is what the climate around Mahmoud Abdul-Rauf had become by the spring of 1996. He was not simply unpopular. He was a lightning rod for a kind of fury that extended far beyond sports commentary. Inside that storm, Abdul-Rauf was increasingly isolated. The compromise he had reached with the league, standing with eyes closed, praying silently, satisfied the NBA's public relations needs, but did almost nothing to calm the public. The words he had spoken could not be unsaid. The label had been applied. And in professional sports, labels like that do not wash off. They follow you into every locker room, every front office meeting, every contract negotiation. They sit in the background of every decision made about your future. And then, just months after the suspension, the Denver Nuggets did what many people suspected they would do. They got rid of him. The trade details tell you everything you need to know about how much his value had collapsed. In June of 1996, the Nuggets completed the transaction. Mahmoud Abdul-Rauf was sent to the Sacramento Kings in exchange for Šarūnas Marciulionis, a 32-year-old Lithuanian guard whose best years were well behind him, and a second-round draft pick. That was it. That was the return for a 27-year-old scorer who had averaged better than 19 a game that season, who had dropped 51 on the Jazz 6 months earlier, who had led the league in shooting from the stripe twice, and who had won Most Improved Player just 3 years before. In any normal basketball context, a player with that resume commands a significant return. First-round picks, rotation players in their prime, maybe a young prospect the acquiring team can develop. That is what a scorer in his mid-20s, in the statistical prime of his career, is worth on the open market. Mahmoud Abdul-Rauf was worth a fading veteran and a late-round selection. The math does not work unless you account for the thing that no trade document will ever list: the baggage, the controversy, the fear of what he represented. Denver wanted him gone. The front office needed to move past the anthem story and rebuild without the distraction. And every other team in the league had the same calculation running through its front office. If we bring this player in, do we bring the firestorm with him? Sacramento, to its credit, was willing to take the chance. But the terms of the deal made it clear that Abdul-Rauf was arriving in Northern California not as a prized acquisition, but as a reclamation project, trading at a fraction of his actual value. The question that hung over the entire transaction was one the league preferred not to answer publicly. Was this a basketball decision, or was the NBA collectively punishing a player for being too uncomfortable? The trade alone does not prove collusion, but the pattern, the suspension, the firestorm, the diminished return, and what came next, tells a story that is hard to read any other way. And whatever slim hope remained that Abdul-Rauf could rebuild his career in Sacramento, that hope passed away slowly, painfully, over 2 seasons in which his role shrank to almost nothing. He arrived in Sacramento as a player who still had everything that had made him dangerous in Denver. The jumper had not abandoned him. The quickness was still there. The basketball IQ, the court vision that had produced that 20-assist night, the relentless practice habits driven by a condition he had carried since childhood. All of it remained intact. What changed was opportunity. His minutes dropped. His shot attempts dropped. His role within the Kings' offense narrowed from featured scorer to complementary piece to something that looked, by the end, like an afterthought. The decline in the box score was staggering in its speed. In his final Denver season, he had been a 19-a-game scorer, a player opposing coaches built their defensive game plans around. By his last year in Sacramento, the 1997-98 campaign, that number had fallen to 7.3. From a primary weapon to a reserve who barely registered on the stat sheet. Was it the coaching staff's philosophy? Was it the roster construction? Was it the invisible hand of a league that had made its feelings about Mahmoud Abdul-Rauf very clear the moment it suspended him? There is no single document, no leaked memo, no executive going on the record to confirm that his diminished role was punishment. But the circumstantial evidence is damning. This was a player in the physical prime of his career, not injured, not aging, not struggling with his shot. And he was being buried. Consider what that does to a competitor. This was a man who had scored 965 points as a college freshman, who had been named the best player in the Southeastern Conference twice before he could legally drink, who had proven he could produce at the highest level of professional basketball. And now, he was sitting on a bench in Sacramento watching lesser talents get the minutes he used to own. The psychological erosion of that experience, the daily reminder that your talent is not the issue, that something else entirely is keeping you from the floor, is a weight that no statistic can capture. By 1998, Mahmoud Abdul-Rauf had had enough of the NBA. Or perhaps the NBA had had enough of him. He made a decision that stunned the basketball world. He left America entirely. In 1998, with no meaningful NBA offers materializing and his Sacramento tenure finished, Abdul-Rauf signed a 2-year contract worth $3.4 million with Fenerbahce, one of the premier basketball clubs in Turkey. For a player who had been a top 3 draft pick just 8 years earlier, the move overseas was a stark admission. The American basketball establishment no longer had a place for him. Turkey was not unfamiliar cultural territory. As a Muslim, Abdul-Rauf found himself in a predominantly Muslim country where his faith was not a controversy, but a norm. The basketball was professional, competitive, and well-organized. Fenerbahce was not a minor league outfit. It was a storied franchise with passionate fans and real resources. On paper, it could have been a soft landing, a chance to play without the weight of a nation's anger pressing down on every possession. But it did not last. According to reports, Abdul-Rauf left Fenerbahce before his contract was finished, citing a loss of interest. After years of fighting for respect in the NBA, after the suspension and the trade and the systematic reduction of his role, something inside him had shifted. The fire that had driven him to shoot thousands of jumpers in empty gymnasiums, the competitive fury that had produced 51 points against elite defenders, it was fading. Not because he lacked ability, but because the joy had been extracted from the game by everything that surrounded it. He sat out the entire 1999-2000 season, a full year away from professional basketball. No team, no contract, no court. For 12 months, a man who had been playing organized basketball since a middle school coach pulled him off a playground in Mississippi simply stopped. Then, in August of 2000, a lifeline appeared. The Vancouver Grizzlies, a struggling expansion franchise on the western edge of Canada, signed him. He played 41 games that season, all coming off the bench, averaging 6.5 per game. It was a ghost of what he had been. The quickness was diminished. The role was limited. The stage was a franchise that would relocate to Memphis within a year. He was 31 years old, and the NBA he returned to barely recognized him. After that season, there were no more contracts, no more invitations. Mahmoud Abdul-Rauf's NBA career was over. And what came next would be far worse than anything that had happened on a basketball court. In August of 2000, the phone rang. On the other end was an offer from the Vancouver Grizzlies, a franchise that had entered the league just 5 years earlier and had never come close to relevance. They were young, they were losing, and they were desperate enough to take a flyer on a 31-year-old guard the rest of the league had quietly decided to forget. Abdul-Rauf accepted. There was no negotiating leverage, no bidding war, no courtship from multiple suitors. This was the only door still open, and it led to a roster that would win 23 games that season. The man who had once torched elite Western Conference defenses for 51 in a single outing was now riding the bench for a team playing out its final months in Canada before relocating to Memphis. He appeared in 41 games. Every one of them came off the bench. His average settled at 6.5 points. a number that would have been unremarkable for a journeyman, but was devastating when attached to a player with his resume. The explosiveness that had once made him uncoverable in the open court had dulled. The minutes were sparse. The plays were not designed for him. He was a passenger on a franchise that was itself disappearing. When the season ended, there was no farewell, no press conference, no tribute video, no thank you from the league that had drafted him third overall a decade earlier. The contracts simply stopped arriving. Mahmoud Abdul-Rauf's NBA career ended the way the league had been engineering it to end since March of 1996. Not with a dramatic exit, but with silence. But the worst was yet to come. In 2001, back in Mississippi, his home was destroyed, and what investigators found in the ashes would raise questions that have never been answered. He had gone home. After everything, the suspension, the trade, the diminished role in Sacramento, the brief exile overseas, and the quiet ending in Vancouver, Mahmoud Abdul-Rauf returned to Mississippi. He had a house in Neckise, a small rural community in Hancock County. It was not a mansion. It was not a monument to NBA wealth. It was a home in a quiet place, where a man who had been through an extraordinary amount of public hostility was trying to live a private life. In 2001, that house was burned to the ground. According to the Clarion Ledger, investigators determined it was arson. The fire was not an accident, not a wiring failure, not a kitchen fire that spread, not a lightning strike. Someone set it deliberately. The FBI opened an investigation. Federal agents examined the evidence, pursued leads, and attempted to determine who had destroyed the home of a man who had spent the previous 5 years as one of the most polarizing figures in American sports. No one was ever charged. No arrest was ever made. The case, as far as public records show, remains unresolved to this day. There is no responsible way to assign motive when no perpetrator has been identified. What can be stated, what the factual record makes unavoidable, is the context. This was a man who had been vilified on national television. A man whose protest had prompted strangers to invade a mosque with musical instruments as an act of intimidation. A man who had received hostility from fans, from media figures, and from segments of the public for years. And now, his home had been reduced to ashes by someone who, according to investigators, did it on purpose. The fire took everything. Whatever physical remnants of his career were inside that house, whatever personal belongings, whatever memories, were gone. And the absence of accountability, the silence from law enforcement after the initial investigation, added a final, devastating layer to a story that was already defined by unanswered questions. For 15 years, Mahmoud Abdul-Rauf's story remained largely forgotten, a cautionary tale buried in the archives. And then, in 2016, another athlete refused to stand, and suddenly, the whole world remembered who had done it first. 20 years is a long time to wait for vindication, if vindication is even the right word. In the summer of 2016, San Francisco 49ers quarterback Colin Kaepernick began kneeling during the national anthem before NFL games, protesting racial injustice and police brutality. The reaction was volcanic. Television pundits raged. Fans burned jerseys. The President of the United States weighed in. It dominated the national conversation for months. And almost immediately, journalists and historians began asking the same question. Who did this before? The answer led them straight back to a 5'10" guard who had played for the Denver Nuggets in a different century. Abdul-Rauf's name resurfaced in major publications and broadcast segments across the country. The parallels were impossible to ignore. Two athletes, two anthems, two firestorms separated by 2 decades. But the differences were just as striking. Kaepernick had social media. He had allies across multiple sports. He had a cultural moment that, however contentious, included significant public support. When he knelt, millions knelt with him, in spirit, if not in body. Abdul-Rauf had none of that. In 1996, there was no platform to amplify his voice beyond the sports page and the evening news. There was no coalition of athletes ready to stand beside him. There was no hashtag, no viral clip, no mechanism for ordinary people who agreed with him to make their agreement visible. He absorbed the full weight of a nation's backlash essentially alone, backed by his faith and nothing else. The 2016 revisiting of his story did not undo what had happened. It did not restore the years of prime basketball that were taken from him. It did not rebuild the house. But it did something that mattered. It placed his protest in a historical lineage. It reframed what had been dismissed as a radical act by a fringe figure into what it actually was. An early chapter in a movement that would eventually reshape the entire relationship between professional athletes and civic expression. Whether you call him a pioneer or a cautionary tale depends on what you believe athletes owe the public and what the public owes athletes. But the factual record is not ambiguous. He was there first, he paid more, and he did it alone. Strip away the controversy, strip away the anthem, the suspension, the trade, the fire. Look only at the basketball. A player drafted 3rd overall, most improved player, 2-time league leader in accuracy from the charity stripe, including a season that ranks among the 3 or 4 best ever recorded. A career-high scoring night of 51 against an elite defensive team. A 20-assist game that proved he could do more than shoot. An all-rookie selection. A scoring average that sat near 20 per game during his best stretch. He played in the NBA for 9 seasons and was only 27 when the machinery started pushing him out. Now ask the obvious question. What would that career have looked like without March 12, 1996? There is no honest way to answer it with certainty. Injuries could have intervened. His size might have caught up with him eventually. The league was changing, and there is no guarantee that any player sustains peak production into his 30s. But the trajectory, the upward arc of a player who was still improving when the controversy hit, suggests that what the basketball world received from Mahmoud Abdul-Rauf was a fraction of what he was capable of delivering. He did not lose his career to substance issues. He did not lose it to legal trouble or financial recklessness. He lost it because he said something the league and the country were not ready to hear. And the system responded the way systems always respond when an individual becomes inconvenient. It removed him. Quietly. Methodically. Through trades that undervalued him, minutes that evaporated without explanation, and a free agent market that collectively decided to look the other way. His story is not comfortable. It does not resolve neatly. There is no final scene where the league apologizes, no ceremony where the wrongs are acknowledged, no contract that makes up for the lost years. There is only the record, the numbers, the timeline, and the undeniable fact that a brilliant basketball player was erased from the sport he had mastered because he refused to be silent. The boy from Gulfport with Tourette syndrome who was written off before he could read at grade level became a record-setting college scorer, a top 3 draft pick, and a player whose shooting mechanics were a generation ahead of his time. And then he became the answer to a question that professional sports has never been willing to ask honestly. What happens to the athlete who tells the truth before the world is ready to hear it? Mahmoud Abdul-Rauf found out. The rest of us are still deciding what that answer means.